Hello everybody, and welcome to another Replica Airguns instructional video. My name is Michael K, and today we're doing a bit of a CO2 versus spring versus pump airgun comparison. So we're talking about the propulsion system that each styles of these guns use. So in other words, if you're looking at a real gun, a bullet, it uses gunpowder. That gunpowder is the charge or the propulsion that propels the bullet. So what we're talking about here with air guns is we have basically three different things. There's actually four. You've got CO2, which is a gas. You have a spring piston. And then you have, well, I'm going to talk about pump, so multi-pump or single pump guns. But there's also PCP, which is pre-charged pneumatic. I'll kind of cover that, but it's not commonly used with replica style air guns too much, more so with hunting and target guns. Alright, so all these three systems we're going to be talking about, CO2, spring, pump, they create pressure that forces the ammunition with a high force out of the barrel. Again, similar to how gunpowder is the source of energy for a bullet. Now, CO2 air guns use the expansion of CO2 gases to create the pressure required for the ammo. Now, I'm primarily talking about air guns, but with airsoft guns, you're usually using things like green gas or propane, but similar type of thing. Airsoft gun or AEG guns that don't use gas will use a spring that pushes a piston, but it's usually powered by a battery and motor system, as opposed to with most pellet air guns, you have to crank that spring and piston yourself. Now, spring air guns use the release of a pre-cocked spring and plunger system to compress air to power the ammo. So again, with a standard pellet air gun like this one here, I have to cock this manually, so there's a spring inside there. And I'm not going to do it all the way because once it's cocked, I got to shoot it. You shouldn't leave spring air guns, especially metal spring. There's something called a gas spring, but you shouldn't. Oh, I've turned this on, but you shouldn't leave, especially spring piston air guns with mechanical metal springs. You shouldn't leave them cocked. It's hard on the spring. It'll damage it. It'll basically weaken the spring. But I cock this, throw a pellet in there, put it back, gun's ready to go, and that's a typical spring piston. Here's another spring piston. It just works a little differently. And this one, I cock it this way, so it's actually using the barrel in an upward motion, sort of a lever, and that cocks this one. This is the Webley Tempest. But both of these guns are spring pistons, and you only have to cock them one time per shot. Now, pump air guns are a little different. Here's a Webley Electo, and this guy here, you basically pump it this way. I can't pump this one up because it's not going to hurt it to release the pressure. I've checked this gun, there's nothing in it. I'm going to release the pressure, so it's got a manual safety. I flick it forward every time. So I can pump this gun 1 to basically 3 times, and the more times I pump it, the more power I get. Okay, so that's that. Let me just talk a little bit about it. So basically every time you pump it, you are forcing more air into a chamber. The more pumps, the more pressure, the more power. Now, CO2 air guns generally store enough CO2 for multiple shots per cartridge. So here's a CO2 gun. You'll notice this gun has a little magazine, and you can put 8 shots in this magazine because the CO2, you don't basically just take, put your CO2 in. There's a CO2 goes in here. I'm just going to bring a gun in just so you can see the CO2. So here's a CO2 canister inside of a gun. Same type of canister would go inside this gun here. I'll just show you it on its own. Here's a canister, CO2 canister. This is a 12 gram. Now, they do come in different sizes. I don't have really any sizes to show you other than that, but they do come in 88 gram. They also come in these really large ones for other types of styles of guns. But essentially, that CO2 canister has enough power, depending on the gun and how much is released with each shot, but you can fire anywhere. This one doesn't actually get a lot of shots because it's forcing a lot of CO2 for the blowback. And for the pellet, it uses heavy pellets. You're going to get maybe 36 shots with this gun, which is very low. But some CO2 guns, non-blowback guns, can get up to 200 shots per CO2 cartridge, 12 gram that is. The spring piston air guns require the cocking again of the spring between each shot, so single shot only. And most pump air guns require at least 1 pump or more pumps, often up to 10 pumps for each shot, and you generally only get 1 shot per set of pumps. Now, not to be confused with PCP air guns, so we'll talk about that real quick. Pre-charged pneumatic, which have a large pressure tank that are basically recharged with a high volume of air. that is capable of shooting multiple shots per charge. Now, some PCP guns can hold extreme amounts of pressure and get super high velocities, and they'll even have rotary mags in them so you can get semi-auto action out of PCP guns. Now, you'll find with CO2 air guns you have a limit as to how much power they can produce, and CO2 has a set vapor pressure of 850 psi, or about 56 bar, and this is at room temperature. Now, room temperature is around 25 degrees Celsius, or converted into Fahrenheit, that would be 77. Now, CO2 gas also requires a warm environment to expand, so warmer temperatures and longer barrels will help with the power. Now, the reason why a longer barrel helps is because as the CO2 is moving through the gun, the CO2 is warming up and expanding. So the shorter the barrel, the CO2 may not fully warm up to room temperature or enough. So the longer barrel means the CO2 expands more because it's got more warmth to absorb. Now, spring air guns are limited to how much effort is humanly possible to cock the spring into position. If you make the spring too strong, then not everyone will be able to use the air gun effectively, right? So some weaker or smaller people aren't able to use these really high-powered spring piston guns because they just don't have the strength to really cock it effectively. Now, too weak of a spring, though, on the other hand, makes the air gun kind of weak in power. So there's sort of a happy medium there depending on the person. So stronger people can buy spring piston air guns with stronger springs, giving them potentially more higher power, whereas smaller, not as strong people may want an air gun that has a weaker spring, so it's just easier to use for them. Now, pump air guns are also somewhat limited to how much effort is humanly possible, since the higher the chamber pressure, the harder it will be to pump the air gun, right? So there's sort of a point of limiting return where you're pumping that thing, it's getting so hard to pump. It also depends on how it's set up. Some guns will sort of use a leverage type factor, so you've got to pump them a lot, but you can get a lot of pressure in there, but they're going to take a long time to get up to pressure, whereas some guns, with each pump, you're putting more pressure in it, but it becomes very difficult. Again, though, you are limited to how strong the person is, to how much power you're going to get out of that gun. So in other words, spring piston and multi-pump air guns are going to have the advantage in power over CO2 because CO2 has a set peak pressure limit, whereas spring piston and multi-pump don't, other than human limitations. Alright, so spring air guns are known for having a fair amount of recoil and vibration when the spring moves both forward and backwards quickly inside the air gun. So you cock the spring manually. When you release it, the spring moves really quickly forward and then kind of snaps back. So you get this vibration that moves forward and backwards. And because of that, you even have to use special scopes for spring piston guns, because what happens, especially with rifles, is that back and forth motion is not normal. So it can actually damage the internals of the scope. So you need to buy special scopes specifically designed for spring piston air rifles. Now, that back and forth vibration creates a recoil that's kind of unusual, and it does take some practice to learn how to shoot a spring piston air gun. The pump and CO2 air guns are known to have very little recoil since the pressure is stored in a chamber and then released by a valve. No slapping back and forth of a large internal spring, so all you're doing is releasing air really quick. There is a tiny bit of recoil depending on the size of the pellet you're using. So if you're using, say, a large 22 caliber or even larger caliber, 25 caliber for instance, pellet, some air guns, some pump air guns can use even larger pellets, especially PCP air guns. Some of them are up to 357 Magnum size or 50 cal versions, so they can get way up there. Now, the larger the bullet, the more you're pushing on something, the more kick you're going to feel. But typically with a .177 or .22 caliber, say it's traveling at 500 to 800 feet per second, you're not going to notice a lot of recoil. Now, spring air guns can use either a mechanical spring or a gas spring. And I was referring to that earlier, so there's mechanical springs like you'd normally see, the coil springs inside a lot of spring piston air guns. But a lot of people are using these gas springs, okay? So they use a gas piston. There's no mechanical spring, it's just pressurized gas. The advantage to that is you don't get the slapping back and forth of the mechanical spring, so they have less recoil. And they're not affected by being cocked over a long period of time. So you can cock a gas spring piston air gun, leave it cocked for a longer time without it affecting the power of the gun. So it's not going to weaken the spring as much. I still wouldn't recommend you keep any gun charged really over any long period of time, with the exception perhaps one pump in a pump gun just to keep the seals and everything kind of tight. Now, some CO2 air guns can also use pressurized air. So for instance, with something like a Draws, you can put different size CO2 tanks on there or cartridges on there. You could also hook up a high pressure air system to them. So you may find that not so much with pistols, but with rifles, these submachine gun type BB guns, those types of things. All right, let's get into some of the pros and the cons. This video is dragging on a little bit, but there's a lot of information for you here. Pros: CO2 airguns allow for multiple shots per CO2 cartridge for more realistic action shooting. CO2 airguns do not require any human effort to charge the gun other than loading the CO2 into the airgun. CO2 airguns allow true semi-auto shooting ability. So spring airguns, they have the potential for higher velocity since the larger and stiffer spring, the greater the output of the force of the bullet. Spring airguns do not require anything other than your ammunition, typically either a pellet or BB. Spring airguns are mechanically very simple, which makes them reliable and less expensive to produce. Now pump airguns, so pros for pump airguns have the potential for high velocity since more pumps equals greater output force, only limited by the user's strength and the pressure rating of the airgun. So it depends on the seals and the valves. Many multi-pump airguns will have a maximum pump limitation so that you don't damage the gun. Pump airguns do not require anything other than your ammunition. Typically, again, either a pellet or BB, most often pellets. Pump airguns have next to no recoil, which makes them very easy to shoot and highly accurate. Cons: CO2 airguns require the purchase and use of CO2, or they simply do not work. Now I get people asking me all the time, do I need CO2 in my gun? Do you need gunpowder in a bullet? Same thing, the CO2 is the propellant. You must have it in the gun. CO2 airguns are very susceptible to temperature changes, especially cold temperatures, since CO2 needs heat in order to expand. Cool down effect can also play a role in the power output of CO2. CO2 airguns have a maximum set amount of power output. Spring airguns require the pre-cocking of the spring for each shot, so that's a con. Spring airguns can take some getting used to since the spring recoil vibration requires a very loose grip to shoot accurately with them. And the grip I'm talking about, it's called the military grip. So with a rifle, for instance, you hold your palm flat, the gun rests on your palm. So with spring piston guns, you do not hold them tight or that vibration can affect accuracy. Spring airguns should not be stored pre-cocked since it can damage the spring. Now again, that's less so important with the gas spring versions, but again, I wouldn't keep either versions cocked. Now pump airguns require pre-pumping to pressurize the air chamber for each shot. Pump airguns, especially multi-pump airguns, take the most amount of work for each shot because you're pumping them up as many as 10 times. Now pump airguns need to be stored with at least one pump in them or the seals can get damaged over time. So keep that in mind. Alright, this wraps up the CO2 versus spring piston versus pump airgun comparison. Don't forget to subscribe before you head out. Check us out on Facebook and Twitter. Username is Replica Airguns. Don't forget to come on down to the replicaairguns.com website where we have our Canada and US stores there for you. And again, we sell air guns, BB guns, pellet guns, airsoft guns, blank guns, knives, and other accessories. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.